Notewell. Everybody know what Notewell is? I think this group probably knows what Notewell is, but it's there. Next slide. The agenda is exactly what we announced prior. We will have an overview by each of the authors in a random order. We will have, Elliot's prepared a little bit of comparison just to have you thinking in interesting ways, let's say, and we'll have a discussion. And in the last 10 minutes, we will take some hums and see if we have any consensus or not. We'll see. And then depending on that, we'll figure out what our next steps are. Any comments on the agenda? Okay. Let's go right in. Neville, you're up.
Okay, well.
Neville, do you want to share your slides or shall I share them for you?
Would you share them for me, please? I'm starting to feel a bit computer challenged. It really is high time. I bought a more modern machine, but I like my old machine. Well, okay, I think mine was the first of the drafts to be posted. And at the time, which is back in June, it was starting to irritate me that some of the people making proposals on the list didn't seem to appreciate how long it takes to make changes to the series or how much work and effort Heather had put into her move towards what turned out to be XML to RFC version 3. So she started that not very long after she was appointed, and it took her 2 years and 3 rather noisy boffs to come up with a RFC 6949. That's what set out the requirements for the new format. And then she got together a design team, which was, I can't remember, it was 8 or 10 people, but it was a whole lot of different people who understood the various things that were involved, HTML and style sheets. And I'm sorry to say, me as the SVG person. And in the end, which took another couple of years, we actually no, it took 5 or 6 years after that, which got us to the set of RFCs 79, 90 through 98, which spelled it all out. And after that, it was passed to the tools team, who found suitable contractors to do the work involved in getting it going. And then it was left to Heather and the production centre to start trying to getting it into use and testing it without doing bad things to the productivity, the flow of RFCs through the production centre. And my sort of takeaway point from that, the big summary, was that the RFC influence in big projects, big changes, really is something that takes years, and it doesn't seem to me to lend itself to hiring an outside expert for a short time. And then I got on from there, which was following up on posts from Brian and Mike, and put up a sort of straw man RFC series editorial board, which should be well separated from the IAB and have strong input from the series input streams. But that particular proposal has clearly been overtaken by Brian and Mike's and Martin's drafts after it. So I'm not going to go any further with that. And I've got a couple of other sort of comments. One of the things which turned up on the list recently was the question of updating the style guide. That is something which the RFC editors and whoever is looking after the series at that, well, on a day-to-day basis, in this case, John Levine, need to sort out. And John put a post up to the list pointing out that this is something which needs somebody there all the time, because changes have to be made to keep things moving. And it seems to me that John's doing a good job on that. So that's my summary of my draft. And as I said, it's a background draft, but it does point out the need for a long-term interest in to carry through any changes which we might decide to make. And by the way, I'm not against changes particularly, but they need to be worked through carefully. And the other drafts seem to handle the question of consensus on that pretty well. If there's any questions, I'm happy to respond. Or am I just talking to myself?
We can hear you.
Questions. We're at this point. This is questions for clarification only. That's what questions
Exactly.
at this point are.
Sure.
Any questions? Not hearing any.
Good.
All right. Martin.
Long slides.
These are not my slides. In fact, I did not send slides because I intended to use words.
Yeah, no slides. As I recall, no slides.
Indeed.
Go ahead.
Part of that is I don't think there's any need for a. Oh, thanks, John. There is a Jabber room. I don't think there's any need to go over the details of the proposal. There's a number of questions that people have had with respect to particularly things like the style guide, which I think sort of goes to this question of what the strategic direction needs to be as opposed to the individual tactical things that happen on a day-to-day basis. I believe that the job that Neville has articulated in his presentation there was the need for long-term strategic oversight. Eka's been banned. I'll have to try that myself. Long-term strategic oversight and the sort of day-to-day tactical things that may be involved in making decisions about whether you put a comma in this particular place or, as I recently experienced, the style of reference that was necessary for a particular external reference. And so the idea there is that in the model that I've described was that there would be greater responsibility for the team that does the editing and the publication side of things for making those day-to-day technical decisions. And part of their responsibility would then be to capture those places where they made decisions that weren't captured in style guides. And the strategic side of things would be able to make then decisions about whether those individual tactical decisions represented a need for strategic direction and would essentially be in a position to approve or reject those things. I think the suggestion was that there was a void that was necessarily present in this case, and that when these small tactical decisions came up, that someone would need to be making those, making a decision there. And the conclusion that I've come to is that the RPC, as they currently are competent to make a lot of those decisions. The question is whether they I apologize, I've had 5 hours of sleep thanks to an interim. I'm losing my train of thought. So they need to make tactical decisions, and I think they're competent to do that. The trick will be to capture those and make sure they're properly recorded. I think that's basically all I needed to say at this point.
All right. Any questions for clarifications? I'm hearing none.
And one quick question I had on actually Martin's, and because the language is the same on Brian's, that I never asked was, you allow for the LLC to delegate. Could whoever's running a sorting machine stop it, please? Okay, I don't know who that is.
I wish I could figure out who that was.
I think it's Brian.
Okay, so let's hopefully. The hell is that coming from?
Coming in and out.
Okay. Well, he's muted, so hopefully it'll stay. So the question I had was that most of the the proposals we all have mostly settled on the LLC as the position for the contracting of whatever. In both yours and Brian's, you've got an ability to delegate that, but you don't go into any more detail. And as I read it, we could end up with you delegating right back to the IAB, who could then delegate to an RSOC like organization. Could you talk a little bit more about what you had in mind there, please?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, Mike. This is one area that I may have decided something here, and Brian's not really changed it. So I'm not going to answer for Brian as to whether or not this is his decision. But my thinking here was that this was probably something that the LLC, specifically Jay, might decide to assign a manager for instance, if that was necessary. I don't think it's necessary. I think the delegation of the LLC is probably to the executive director, and that's the nature of that delegation, and that's all that happens. But I think that's deliberately a matter for the LLC to deal with, and that was my decision. If we want to bring that into scope for this discussion, I think it's well within our charter to do that. But I didn't think it was worth belaboring that point.
Yeah, and the reason I asked it because I was very specific about making sure that it was delegated to a fiduciary of the LLC, basically a J or somebody like a J who's under contract or related to them, as opposed to a general delegation to a person or a group, as you quoted there. So I just wondered.
I see. Yeah, I think yours is reasonable. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I don't have a strong opinion on this point.
That was one of my biggest sticking points with respect to your proposal. So thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Brian, you there?
Which Brian do you mean?
Sorry, Brian Rosen.
I am here and speaking to mute.
Oh, okay.
Any other questions for clarifications? I actually have found and fixed my problem, and I should be able to share this window. Huh, look at that. All right. That your slides, Brian?
Those are my slides.
Oh, sorry. What have I done?
And you should be able to actually share the program rather than the window. So that'll get a bigger picture of that.
That's what I did. I said, let's go back to here.
Never mind.
Share content. I mean, I can try it from the browser and open it up in the browser. That might work. Need to get the right ones in the browser.
We want Brian's slides now, right?
Yes, we want Brian's slides now. That's what I want to do.
Which is, and you're messing with Mike's.
I know. I'm just going to get to his and try it in the browser and see whether that share web browser. Okay, now does that show the right thing?
You gotta click on like explode it out to be the largest, to pick up the window.
Get full screen.
Full screen.
Okay, I can go to full screen. I can definitely do that. How's that?
Yeah, that did not. Oh, there we go.
Yep, good enough. Shall I
right.
start?
Go.
Okay, this is pretty short. There's only 2 slides, and a lot of my material was copied from Martin's draft anyway. And by the way, I do agree with his answer on the previous question about the LLC possibly delegating, but only within its own power, if you like. The main difference in what I'm proposing is that the working group it's set up should be very clearly labeled as advisory rather than whatever it was called in his draft. I very strongly support the idea of an open working group. I think that gets by some of the problems we've had in the past. I believe we should be clear in our minds that the series is to serve the whole community, not the IETF. And that's why I have a preference for routing the responsibility at ISOC and not at the IAB. I realize that that may not turn out to be possible, but it's my personal preference. However, where I think I mainly disagree with Martin is I'm pretty convinced, for reasons that Neville alluded to, that we need a professional advisor, not an authority, because we've had trouble with split authority in the previous model, but an advisor who is a serious professional in the business of publishing, not a professional in the business of protocol design. And incidentally, I would propose adding an RFC editorial RFC stream for documents that are about the series as opposed to documents that are about something else. I want to emphasize, I believe editorial authority is not an issue. It's per stream. We seem to have consensus on that. And I want to be clear that the management of the contract side of things, the objectives, the targets, all that stuff, is part of the LLC's job. I don't think we should extract it from the LLC's line of command. If you can move down to the second slide.
Ryan, can I ask you a question on that slide before you move on?
Sure.
You use the word set strategy by an advisor.
No, by the group, the working group. Okay, which is very similar to what's in Martin's draft.
I see. I get it now.
Okay, thanks. So going on to slide 2, here's a little bit more about the advisor. Senior professional with deep knowledge of technical publishing, we've seen that before, provides expert advice to the working group and to the production team, because I can't imagine the production team not needing that kind of advice from time to time. The person would be expected to act as a thought leader. You know, we don't formalize that in the IETF, but it's pretty clear that we do have people who function as thought leaders in individual working groups, so not necessarily the working group chairs. I put this person under a professional services contract with the LLC because I don't see any other way to pay them. It's not going to be done for free. And this is a point that's not mentioned in my draft and should have been. The hiring of this advisor would take place by the LLC, but it would have to take place on advice from community sources, and the only one we've got in the model would be the working group chairs. That's an area that might need more work. You know, there might have to be a selection committee like there was for the old RFC role. But basically, I'm trying to rework Martin's model to include the role of this advisor because I think we need such a person. And I'm trying to make sure that person is not stuck in part of a matrix management model, which is one of the things I think we had going wrong before. So that's it.
Okay. Any questions for clarification?
So this is Lucy, and I have a question for clarification here that sort of rolls up Neville's advice on long-time strategy and Martin's draft and your draft. I'm concerned about where consensus happens across the streams, and the format work is a good example of that. And I want to know where in this model this senior advisor gets authority other than being the editorial manager of the editorial stream?
My answer is that this is why there are chairs for the advisory working group, and they determine consensus according to IETF type rules. And that's why I want to link back to ISOC as a supreme authority when there's dispute. But I think that's the chain of authority, the working group chairs, and then whoever is the final court of appeal for those working group chairs. So specifically, the advisor is helping to form consensus, but does not determine the consensus. That's my answer. But I think Martin gets to answer too.
So that board is responsible for developing community consensus?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Martin?
so I think I agree with with Brian to the extent that it's a working group process, and we have an understood process for that. You said one thing that I will take a little bit of exception to. I don't know if Brian caught this or not, but you said, how does this advisor gain authority? And I think the point here is that there's no strong authority vested in this individual. Brian's suggesting an advisor here, and I would have a similar role on an ad hoc basis. That is, someone would be contracted as needs dictate rather than on a permanent basis. But again, that person would provide advice, not be expected to make authoritative decisions.
And I'm fine with that as long as there is somewhere that consensus is being managed across all of the communities of interest.
Right. And I think both Brian and I say that this working group model is where those people go to take their concerns and work through them.
So then, following up on the ISOC as opposed to IAB question, when there's a dispute about a consensus call, where does that go?
So I proposed the dispute about a consensus call would go to the IAB. Brian has suggested that they go to the ISOC board. I think it was in the proposal.
That's correct. I mean, it needs work. For a start, we don't know if ISOC would agree to do it, but the reason I don't like this being terminating, if you like, at the IAB is that, we need to be very clear that a lot of people read RFCs who aren't in our community. So even if you consider the reading community as well as the writing community, I think we need something a little bit broader as our source of authority.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a gap in all our models.
Any other questions for clarification? Okay.
Can you go back to the first page real quick?
Yes.
I'll save it for later. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So we're now going to Mike.
Let me try sharing my own.
Okay.
Thanks.
Stop sharing.
There we go. Yay. Okay, so my model is actually sort of similar to what we've currently got right now. We have an expert that's hired on a long-term basis to provide knowledge that we don't normally have. Call it the RFC, call it the advisor, whatever. The actual title versus the roles are going to be defined in whatever contracts we end up putting together. So I think with respect to that, I'm probably similar to Brian and Neville, and maybe not so much with Mark, because I do not believe this can be done on an ad hoc basis, and that's my major difference with respect to him. When I looked at Mark and Brian's documents, especially the beginnings from Mark, I looked at the diagrams and was was bothered by the fact that strategy seemed to flow through the LLC, and I knew that wasn't the case. And part of the problem was that we were combining two different relationship models, and we needed to be splitting those into pieces. So that's what I did here. This first one is describing the contract and the personnel relationships, and similar to what Neville put together, this is a RFC series editorial board model where the direct stakeholders for the series are the primary inputs to how the series is done, and that is the stream managers for the IAB, the independent stream manager, and the other stream managers, plus 3 at-large members, including one from ISOC, if we can get them to go along with it. The LLC is responsible for the hiring and firing. Recommendations come in from the RSEB for what they should do there, but the final decisions are the LLC's based on the contract, on what the community's already said with respect to the documents on how we want to do this. So the RSEB is not the final answer here. The LLC is going to be looking at, is going to be taking a look at what's going on and saying, okay, yeah, we need to continue or not with respect to that. Let's see. The operational model is quite a bit simpler than when you break this all out. Again, coming from Neville's model, we create a new stream, and I call it series. I should be stream here, the editorial stream, and this is where we put all the documents to describe in the meta content of how the RFC series is put together, published, evolves, and things along those lines. The RFC is there as the hired gun to work with the RSEB to create those policies, document them, have them approved by the RSEB for publication within the stream, and then executed by the RRC, the RPC, and other contractors. This is the segment that I really wanted Elliot to put onto the slide that he's going to show next, because I thought strategic decisions was the wrong way of thinking about it. You need to be thinking about each of the pieces of them. So the concept of what the strategy is the RRC and the RCB working partnership with community input. Again, the stream managers are going to have the biggest input with respect to this because they're the ones that are trying to get documents published. The RRC is then going to be responsible for dealing with actually writing down what the concepts are, and the RSEB gets the final vote before they get published in the stream. That is a nice manageable model. And then finally, the execution is the RRC, the RPC, the contracts, again with RSEB advice, not control, because again, the contract is with the LLC, not with the RSEB. So anyway, this is, I didn't change, I don't think we need to change a lot about the publication streams right now. Mainly, I wanted to get us away from the model of 2 levels of indirection on people directing other people. The RSOC over the RC series editor was just handled very badly, in my opinion. So anyway, that's it.
Questions for clarification? Okay. Elliot, you want to present your slides? You want me to do it, or do you want to present it yourself?
I'll present mine.
Okay.
Just give me a sec here. All right, and then let's see here. I click on this button, and there we go.
Yeah.
Guys, the slideshow or the wrong one?
We see your screen with all the extra notes.
How's that better?
That's much better. Yes.
All right. So this is Elliot's informal comparison, and it's necessarily incomplete. Why is it necessarily incomplete? Because 4 people went to great lengths to write down their thoughts in far more detail than one can fit on one slide. But this is just a little bit about how you might organize your thinking, and you may completely disagree with any of the rows, columns, or content that you see here. It's just my view of things, and if you agree, that's great that this is the view. If not, feel free to make your own. We have 4 drafts. You will, I think, find that the first 2 here really have the same sort of root, and the second 2 have the same root as is convenient. Going down in columns, these I spotted, or at least I think are close to correct. The RPC function under Neville's and Mike's proposals are both is pretty much as is. They're pretty much being asked to do much the same as to what they're doing, at least so far as I could tell. And of course, after I'm finished, please feel free to correct anything that you think I got wrong. Under Brian's and Martin's proposals, what we have is a new thing, which is the RFC editor program. And please tell me if I got the acronym right. That essentially is the RPC function with perhaps a little bit more. Hey, sorry about that. What happened here? It's pretty much the RPC plus maybe a little bit more structure, if I understand, but it's pretty much it's roughly speaking the RPC. Under the RSC function, the RSC is largely intended to function and have similar responsibilities as they have today under Neville's and Mike's proposals, whereas in Brian's proposal, it becomes a strictly advisory function that reports to the RFC series advisory working group and advises both the RSAWG and the REP. And then also under Brian's proposal, it's responsible, the RSC is responsible for documenting consensus. Under Martin's proposal, these functions are devolved into the open program, which I list as a working group, and also some go to P, but that's about that little asterisk there, which I'll get to in a minute. The strategic decisions, this is the one that Mike took issue with, and this is necessarily a summary of that. If you have a table, you only have so much real estate. And here, the strategic decisions under Neville's approach are largely based on the RFC series editorial board. And Mike presented his, so his is more complete than what you see here. This is a very simple summary. With Brian, these decisions happen in this advisory working group, and that is similar in nature to what Martin had to say. And then, of course, there's this notion of strategic, which Martin drew out in his presentation and is probably worthy of additional conversation. For the oversight of the RSC and RSA, we have the LLC pretty much throughout, except for Martin, because he doesn't have one. He doesn't have this advisory role, but pretty much it's the LLC with, in Mike's case, an optional contractual monitor. And you see 2 asterisks here because in conversations with Brian, he thought he might wish to evolve his thinking a little bit as to exactly how this works. The selection process under Neville's proposal is through the LLC. And with Mike's, there's a search committee, which is drawn from the RCB and the LLC. In Brian's model, you have the LLC again with 2 asterisks, and of course with Martin, since he doesn't have one of these, it's not applicable. For community engagement, so the community would engage the RFC series editorial board along with the RFC interest list. In Mike's proposal, there would be RFCB open meetings, solicited input on documents, and he makes the point that there's not a community consensus required for the RFC editor series documents. Under Brian, it's all about an open working group, and this is the same with Martin. For oversight and advisory group construction, under Neville's proposal, it's with a non-com plus some ex officio members. With Mike, it is largely, and this is not entirely, it's largely by the stream managers or representatives and some at-large participants. Or at-large.
I'd say that's pretty much the same as it's non-com and ex officio.
Okay. And then with Brian, it's open participation, but the stream managers are required, stream representatives are required to be present, as is the RSA. And with Martin, it's open participation. The chair selection, Neville didn't get that far, as I understand, but with Mike's proposal, it's the RSC and with ISC feedback, or fallback rather, the two are the chairs. Brian recommends co-chair selected by the Board of Trustees from ISOC, whereas Martin pulls from the IAB. And then I put in here minimum participation just in case like things got really quiet, who'd actually show up. Turns out, at least in this program, that hasn't been, but I looked at the numbers, there's been a fair amount of participation from the community. I don't have them at hand, but they're less scary than I was concerned about. It's not just, you know, a handful of people. But the minimum participation under both Neville and Mike's proposals are the RSCB members. In the case of Brian, it's the stream representatives plus the RSC plus the chairs. And in Martin's, it's the chairs. Now, presumably that's something that could get fixed quick in terms of, you know, making sure that at least somebody, you know, a few people show up. And I can't imagine the stream managers and stream reps not wanting to show up.
Yeah. So Elliot, just to clarify on this point, I didn't understand this point when you presented the summary to me, but I think having the stream representatives required to participate in this program is sensible. I don't think it's a major point.
I don't think so either. I think this is one that we were calculating that indeed somebody was showing up apart from the chairs at a minimum. And then for appeals chain, and this is something that is probably
so just another clarifying. So that sort of makes the minimum participation all the same, right?
Pretty close to it once you say that. Yes, exactly right, Bob.
Okay, good.
Good catch. For the appeals chain, this is something that's probably worthy of discussion. There's no appeals that come out of the RSCB, and in discussions with Mike, and Mike, please correct me if I'm misstating this, you weren't sure what there was to appeal in terms of that discussion. And I guess it depends also on what you view as the decision points in process, and probably there's a little bit of this line may be just a bit too brief.
Yeah, let me hit that after you're done with this, and
okay.
I can explain a little bit more what I was thinking about that.
Okay. In Brian's draft, he calls out specifically the ISOC Board of Trustees for and these would be, I guess, for consensus calls. And of course, the oversight remains with the LLC, and I'm sure that would be the case for all of these for the RPC/REP. IAB for the program that Martin designed, and so that's the table. And before I go any further, Mike, why don't you go ahead and get your point across?
Yeah, sorry about that. I thought I muted, so apologies for the noise. The key thing here is figuring out what can be appealed and over applying the IETF working group or process model to a group that has to make forward progress much faster than normal working groups do, or at least try to make more progress than normal working groups do, suggests that we basically select the people and get out of their way and let them do the job. And the appeals chain, if you will, is to basically replace the streams manager if they're not doing what the streams tell them to do, or the at-large managers if they're not doing what the community tells them to do, rather than try and figure out how another organization fits into that process with respect to what appeals can they cover. So we've already dealt with the personnel things and said those aren't appealable. So I would then ask what's appealable with respect to the things that have gone out recently.
Okay, before that gets answered, that's a good point for the discussion topics, which are that's just coming up after this. I will add one more point of information and then I'll stop. In Brian's proposal, he has the ISOC Board of Trustees involved in 2 places. This is a thing where we know we'll need, if they're going to be involved, we need to ask them, and the chairs have been in discussions with Alyssa, and I had an informal conversation with Andrew about how to go about that. And we're still working through the exact right process. But if the group as a whole decides that this is something that needs to be explored, then we liaison to the ISOC Board of Trustees, either directly or through the IAB, depending on what guidance we're given from the IAB on that, in terms of getting answers as to whether or not they'd be willing. But we'll also have to make sure we write out and review what we're sending to the Board of Trustees really carefully so that they understand what they'd be signing up for. So that's just informational at this point. And with that, I'll stop. And Brian has to unmute.
There we go. The floor is open.
So
How are we using plus Q, or what are we going to do for Q management?
Yeah, there's no tool here.
Yeah, just use the
Got it.
chat.
Go ahead.
That
Yeah,
works
put
for
your
me.
name. Put your name in WebEx chat, and I'll recognize you. Let's do it that way.
WebEx says raise hand.
Is it? Where
Yeah,
is
but only Cindy can see that, and you don't get an order.
So let's just use the plus Q, and you've got a Q going.
Yeah, just put it in the chat. Put your name in the chat, and the WebEx chat, and we'll recognize you.
Martin's there.
Martin, go ahead.
I was
Brian,
merely
go ahead.
waiting for recognition. Thank you. So I think there's a couple of questions here that really need to be addressed, and I think there's a bunch of things that I could talk about with respect to the differences between what Brian has proposed and what I've proposed, and we could probably make progress there. But I think the bigger question that we need to address is the split between making strategic long-term decisions about the evolution of the series and getting all of the day-to-day tactical stuff out of the way, and the different approaches that the different proposals have taken toward that. I'll put my answer to that one out there at this point. I think that the folks doing the editing need to be largely responsible for dealing with the tactical day-to-day issues. Those are the people who are responsible for delivering and meeting a particular performance target. And so they're in the best position to do that. Part of the problem that I think we've had in the past is that their performance targets have been to some extent dependent on the performance of another entity. and the decision-making processes around making those tactical decisions. And I think we can probably do a lot to alleviate that pressure by changing the nature of their contracts. So, and then we can have a process that is, to the extent necessary, or to the extent possible, rather, free from the pressures of having to resolve things in a timely fashion. And we can concentrate on strategic issues, which is why I think the working group process can work for this one. I agree with Mike that a working group process for dealing with these tactical issues would be kind of a failure.
Okay, thank you. Joel?
Okay. I have to disagree with several of the assumptions in Martin's statements. Trying to have the RPC deal with the decisions about how the series should function strikes me as failing on multiple grounds. For one thing, you have multiple editors operating quasi-independently who are currently working by counting on being given consistent direction. That's great. Their line manager doesn't have any skill in this, and that's fine. They've had Heather and John now filling the role to give them the consistent direction. If you just take that away, you're making a drastic change in the job, including just telling them, hey, you get to figure out how you're supposed to get consistent answers from this. It is not at all obvious to me that this works in any meaning of works. On the obverse side, in terms of the expertise, we're going to need the expertise on an ongoing and regular basis. It's not ad hoc. We don't actually hire our lawyer on an ad hoc basis, and they don't participate on an ad hoc basis. And I think that trying to expect that this expertise, this person would need any time they were participating to know what people were assuming, what the culture was, so they could understand the questions properly. And it's not an ad hoc activity. I think we need a persistent, consistent advisor. Whether they have the authority or not is a different question, but I don't know how to make the RPC work without giving that person the authority to do that part of the job. Maybe they don't have the authority over the strategic part, but over the non-strategic, I don't want to say tactical because it's more than just tactical. It's things which have longer impact but are not strategic, I guess. I think we need to have somebody who can do that. A working group fails at doing that repeatedly. Thank you.
Okay. Mike St. John's?
Yeah. Hi. So I looked at both Brian and Mark's proposals, and I got a little bit concerned. Brian's, because I don't know how the working group model, where you have a charter, a fixed work plan, a people who have signed up for the documents, schedules, works for more than a couple, 3, 4, 5 years. We really try and kill working groups after a period of time rather than put them on life support for 20 years. So that's for Brian. With respect to Martin's one, programs the IAB programs have tended to be related to architectural technology and science, if you will. This tends to be a bit more operational in nature and has more of a down and dirty, or a production or get it done type of model that I don't know is all that compatible with the programs model. So those are my comments on those. Feel free to yell at me for them.
Lucy?
So I want to talk about two things. First, I think there's a tension here between IETF authors and their needs and the series and the strategies of publication and archive and external readers outside the IETF stream. And I don't think those are easy to resolve. And these proposals seem in some part to represent the frustrations of authors and authoring tools versus long-term record of consensus and the series and the archive. Who speaks for the series here is really important to me. I'm not an author, I'm a consumer. So that's an important issue to me. The other thing I'll speak to is the issue of ISOC and whether or not they have a role here. I think because they have both an international set of chapters who are readers and consumers, and because they have a group of commercial supporters who are longtime investors in the IETF, that they're probably an appropriate group here to look to. If I was to think of somebody else outside of this, it would be the NRO or the IGF, all of whom are more problematic than ISOC in terms of our relationships. And I'll just leave that there.
Okay. Bob Hendon.
Hi, I had two sort of thoughts. One is that working groups in the style of IETF working groups do some things really well, but I don't actually think they make strategic decisions very well at all. We see this a lot in groups who try to get consensus on architecture documents, and many times, the documents are abandoned, and the working group is great at doing a protocol or, a solution, but at least when I think of strategic, I don't think that fits into a working group at all. I think you need people who have a stake in the outcome. I think some of the other proposals are better. The other comment is, I think that history, I don't think the IAB should have any major role in this at all. So I think there's a couple other choices and we should go with those, and we don't. Again, I think the IAB has had their opportunity here and didn't, I'll be polite, didn't do very well. So thank you.
Okay. John, Jay Daly.
Thanks. So I'm obviously not going to give an opinion on any of the drafts, but I just want to explain something that's currently happening in practice so that you're aware of this and can factor it into your thinking. One of the things that happened when Heather was the RSC was that authors would come along and say, well, I'd like to be able to do this, or I'd like to be able to do that, and the XML and the tools didn't support that, and a discussion took place with effectively Heather giving the yes/no. Sorry, someone's lots of background noise. Heather was the person who gave the yes/no as to whether or not that was implemented. And there was a lot that Heather would, I'm told, understand about that. There were some elements of the underlying architecture and implementation about things that the way those things are done that would be outside of her skill set. Now that we have John in post, that's not actually part of John's role to do that, to be that decision maker about those things. And so for quite some time we had these questions coming in, going to the RPC. The RPC doesn't see itself as the decision maker about that as well, and it then falling on Henrik's plate as the developer, and Henrik being in the unenviable position of making decisions about those things. And so in order to address that temporarily, there is now a small group that includes John in his role, includes Henrik in his role, Robert Sparks as the tools team PM, and Peter St. Andre from the RSOC, that is the triage group, that when these requests come in, they're the ones that are now deciding whether or not that means that a change has to take place to the V3 XML, or a change has to take place to one of the tools, or whether the working group author is told, no, you can't insert this within that, within that, within this. And so that is an operational role at the moment that is, a sort of weekly basis type of thing that's taking place. So I just wanted you to be aware of that particular process.
Okay, thank you. Hacker?
Yeah, so I guess 3 points. One, I've heard a lot about strategy and how we have to have strategy. I'd really be interested in understanding what that is in a concrete sense. Given that it seems to me that many of the working groups we do set strategy for the entire internet. And so it seems to be setting a strategy for like a bunch of things we want on paper probably is like actually a substantially smaller problem. So I'm not persuaded that working groups can't do that. So if someone can give me some examples of strategy consists of, I'd be very appreciative. Second, I think Lucy raised the point of the series versus the authors. I don't really know what the series is meaningfully. I mean, it's a set of documents. I think primarily what we're trying to do is publish technical specifications. And so the community for that is the people writing them and the people implementing and consuming them. And so I guess I'm not sure, certainly like not really clear how we assemble a community that speaks for that, other than the people doing the writing and the people that they talk to and that send them feedback on their documents and implement all of which we have in the working groups. Third, I think there seems to be this like cut that people are trying to draw one way or the other between whether this RS star position is a advisor or whether they're ahead of once again this word strategy, and I think that to some extent interlocks with the governance question of how this person is engaged. So to give a concrete example, like the LLC hires a lawyer. And we don't like, and like, there's not like a lot of community input on how the LLC hires a lawyer. And if we don't like how lawyers behaving, like, Jay gets rid of them. But on the other hand, we expect Jay to make our strategic decisions. We have a bunch of community governance on how Jay gets selected. I think that's so. I think Mike and I had a bunch of back and forth about how much sort of independence the RFC or the RSA would have, and I think the more sort of independent authority that person has, as opposed to an advisory position, the more important it is for them to be subject to community governance.
Martin Thompson.
So now that we've talked about a diverse grab bag of topics in this thing, and I see that I'm at the bottom of the queue, thanks, Mark. I'd like to ask which one of these issues are the most pressing for people, because I don't see us in the remaining time that we have making significant progress on every single one of the 20 or so issues that I heard raised. I raised the strategy tactics split, and we then got into working groups and who's responsible for what and oversight and all sorts of things. Is there any single topic that you think this pivots on?
Right, I'm going to take that. Let's swing at that. The intent of the chairs was for us to recognize, first of all, whichever draft that way forward, that there were going to be issues that needed to be resolved. And you're right, Martin, we can't resolve them all on the call today. But what we're hoping to focus down on is which one of these drafts, which one starting point, recognizing again that whatever in there could be, issues will be open and the text would be changed based on the consensus of the group. This was the intent of the chairs. Brian, do you want to add to that?
That's exactly right. Our goal today is to pick a starting point. We can take pieces from the other proposals as we proceed, but our goal for this meeting was to see whether there was consensus on one of these as the best starting point. If there isn't, then we'll try something else. But that's our goal. Mark Nottingham. Oh, did you want to? I don't see you. Yeah, you're in the queue. So yeah.
I added myself and then I removed myself. So
hi.
Okay.
All right. So Martin Thompson, you put yourself back in. Did you want to go back in?
I was just saying that in light of that goal, now that I understand what you're trying to achieve, I think it would be useful for us to understand what people's what people think with respect to the three, I think, viable proposals that are on the table, and what of particular proposals they find particularly objectionable that would cause that proposal to be invalid in their eyes. And I guess I will start by saying that I think that Mike's suggestion for closed bodies is absolutely unacceptable in my opinion. I think we need to root this in public discourse.
Anyone else want to get in the queue? We have, about 5 more minutes before we're going to want to try and take some hums.
Just to to help sort things a little bit, let me just ask, I think, Neville, if I understand correctly, in terms of your proposal, you would view Mike's sort of as a more fleshed out version of yours, and maybe you would maybe or vote for, vote is the wrong word, but prefer to advance either Mike's or Brian's or something like that instead. Is that correct, Neville?
That is right. I'd be very happy to go for one of the others.
Okay. Now, the other thing we've heard, just to make it clear, so that really does bring us down to 3. The other thing that I think we heard is that there's really very little difference between Martin and Brian's proposals. So now the only question, I guess what I'll do is I'll say, I'll put this 2 ways. Martin, do you think you could live with Brian's as a starting point?
I can say that I would be I'd be comfortable starting with Brian's on the understanding that there are, I think, 2 major points of difference that we'd have to work through. But on that understanding, I'd be comfortable with you making this a call between what Mike has proposed and what Brian has proposed.
So now we're down to hopefully, and by the way, I think that's a reasonable approach to say, because those are major issues, and I think we have to work towards rough consensus on resolving them. Now I think we're down to 2 under that with that understanding. Does anybody disagree from that point of view? Okay. Ecker.
Yeah, I really want to eliminate Martin's proposal so quickly. I mean, if we want to say that everything between Martin and Brian's proposal is undecided, and we're gonna pick Brian's as a starting point with every difference, Martin's an open issue marker, then I don't care who's on the document. But if this constitutes having, a default assumption of any difference, then no, I'm not okay with that.
A possible way out would be, well, we could first take a hum to see whether people prefer Mike's or one of Martin or Brian, and then if that goes the Martin or Brian way, take another hum for which one of the 2. Would that be all right with you?
I suppose I could live with that. As I say, I guess what I'm trying to avoid here is the assumption that things that are in these documents are pre-decided and have to and require a lot of work to change, which is typically the way these things end up when things are in document, things are written down. And so, as I said, I'd be perfectly happy to have Brian's with like the differences having open issue markers, so they're not decided. But what I'm trying to avoid is the presumption that just because we pick Brian's as a starting point, those need to be changed by consensus to change.
Okay, I think that's a fine thing to do. I think that we can leave if we make this a 2-way hum, and we're in WebEx, we don't really have a hum tool. If we make this a 2-way decision, where with the understanding that if we're going the Brian Martin direction, that the differences between them are expressly open issues to be decided later by consensus, then I think that would be fine. That obviously chairs would like to get this down to a 2-way because it's easier to judge consensus. That's all.
So this is Lucy,
yes.
And I would be unwilling to hum on 1 versus 2. I would not hum for any of those.
And what would you want to do going forward?
I would hum between documents, but the 1 versus 2 leaves too much on the table. I think there are items in Mike's document that are worthy of consideration. If I had to choose, I'd probably be picking Brian's document at this point, which I think can evolve in a direction I'm interested in. Martin's document, I think, leans a little too much in an IETF author-centric direction. And I'm happy to talk about that, but I don't think you resolve this by putting 1 against 2.
Okay. Are there other people who agree with Lucy that trying to do this as a two-way, what are we starting from, expressly saying the differences between the two of them, if we go Martin, whatever our Martin and Brian are expressly items to be worked on, recognizing this is the standard IETF process. We can start with Mike's and it may end up a lot closer to Brian's than where we started from. That's always going to be our process. That is the way the IETF works. We're going to run it that way. But are there other people that have the same concerns that Lucy does about starting with a two-way decision?
I think I share Lucy's concern.
Let's just restate what the two-way means. It means, and Brian, tell me if I got this wrong. Right. It means we hum first for Mike's proposal as opposed to one of either Martin's or Brian's. And then the next hum would be, if it's Martin or Brian's, then the next hum would be which of those two. If it's Mike's, then we're done. Correct?
Well, that wasn't the way it wasn't where I was heading, but we certainly can do that. The way I thought we were heading was we do a simple two-way hum. We start with Mike's or Brian's, and the assumption with Brian's is the differences between Martin and Brian's are expressly open items to be decided by the work group, if that's the direction we go.
Okay.
I think Martin said he was happy with.
I'm left very confused because I don't know what I would be expecting
hey
in the
guys,
starting document.
Guys, there's people in the queue.
Sorry?
You've got Rich, Mike, and John in the queue.
All right. Rich, speak.
Is it asking too much for Martin and Brian to come up with a single document that just lists the open questions as Brian has done in other documents? And then we confirm on the list which way we want to go?
Certainly possible if that's what we want to do.
This is the other Brian.
That was actually a question.
RFC diff. It's really not hard work to do that.
Yeah, that was really a question to the authors.
I think it's premature. And I think you're passing it on to me. Is that right, Brian?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. What I'd rather see is the chairs to go back on that table that you started with and maybe expand it a little bit. And actually, we got 4 or 5 of those lines that basically look the same across all the proposals. So why don't we figure out what's common between all of these things first, get those off the table, and then we can go back and actually continue with the discussions on the items that are there rather than pick one of these things as a winner or loser. Other things, from my point of view, I'm feeling a little bit like the guy standing in front of the doors on Let's Make a Deal and dealing with the Monty Hall paradox. So,
I do want to point out that we spent a long time at the last actual IETF meeting trying to figure out how to get some consensus in one direction or other. We tried hard with this one to set up something that we could get some consensus on moving forward. And in 15 minutes, we're not going to accomplish what you want, which means that we would end this meeting with no consensus on anything.
You're not going to end up on consensus at the end of this meeting anyways. You have to go back to the list.
Yes, of course. We can't, of course. We always are going to go back to the list. We're not going to end up with any final decision here. But you're suggesting that, and you know, we can see what happens on the list. It's very hard to judge consensus on the list. It can be done. With this kind of group, we're likely to be at the next interim meeting before we make any actual decisions. We had John Clemson.
Yeah, I want to go back to where we were quite a while ago and largely agree with Lucy. I think an effort to identify differences, and real differences on the documents, and get that recorded would be worthwhile, and at the same time get recorded where the areas of agreement are. But I think that trying to pit these documents against each other and say then we're going to go argue about where the differences are and what to do with them is a path toward preempting one point of view or another. I have serious disagreements with in some of the areas where Brian and Martin disagree. I have serious disagreements in some of the areas where Mike's document disagrees, especially with Martin's, but to some degree with Brian's. And I don't think it's a reasonable way to proceed, however desirable it might be, to say we have to reach consensus on something, and therefore we're going to start making arbitrary judgments. And I think if we can't figure out how to reach consensus on mailing lists, with some of the efforts which have been suggested about doing some consolidation among the authors, then this effort is dead, because saying that we're going to wait until the next interim meeting and reach consensus there, and then hope the mailing list agrees, is just not how the IETF does business.
I think you have succeeded in frustrating chairs quite a bit.
Sorry about that.
So
they pay big bucks.
Yes, clearly. At this point, I would like to run a three-way hum, and it is start with Mike's, start with Martin's, or don't decide today.
Let me make a suggestion there.
Sure.
For each one of these, both ways, acceptable. How much you can accept it, how much you can't accept it. You're going to get 6 hums.
Okay, that's a reasonable thing to do.
Brian, so you said start with Mike's, start with Martin's. I was assuming you meant start with Brian's.
Yeah, start with Mike's, start with Brian's, and start or not ready was what.
Yes, that my three-way was start with Mike, start with Brian, or not ready to decide.
And then Mike tried to amend that to be, and I wasn't quite sure I could follow it, but it's 2:20 in the morning here, so I might not be able to.
I want to start with Mike. I absolutely refuse to start with Mike. I want to start with Brian. I absolutely refuse to start with Brian's.
Okay.
Or
with Martin.
Or Martin's. Yeah, we can do it with Martin's. We're
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I do think that I'd rather not hum three-way between all 3 drafts. Like, I think we understand that Brian and Martin think they can work out some of their differences and leave the open issues. Like, I get the people like yeah. We're not voting today. Like, so like, this is like, do we want to ask them to go do that with the presumption that they do it acceptably? We're going to take it.
Okay.
Would people be comfortable just typing in this information into the WebEx chat? Is that okay? Would anybody object to that? because the hums are going
Right,
to be
this is
really hard on WebEx.
This is giving up anonymity, right? Are you all right with typing your answer into the chat?
I'm all right with it, but you're going to have a mess trying to figure out what you've gotten.
Oh, we have a record of it. We can figure it out. There's not that many people here. We can count.
I have a bot that can do it for you real quick.
All right. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to chat Brian, Mike, or not today. Brian, Mike, or not today. A lot of people haven't voted. Please let us hear your opinion. It would really be helpful if we could figure out something here. If we're not ready, we're not ready, but I'd like to know that we're not ready. All right. I see very few, relative to the number of people in this meeting. We have not a lot. I've got less than half, I think. All right. We'll take what we got.
So Brian, can I request that we try to test for objections? One of the usual ways we deal with these things is if there's some hard objection that someone has or some issue that they think needs to be resolved with a particular proposal, we test for that as well. That might give us a path.
I would very much like to hear from the not today people to say what will get them to be today the next time. Because I think that's where we are. I think we have enough not readies that's where we are.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we definitely don't have a consensus. Let's say that. We could, we're not voting. We have no consensus.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear from, I think we heard a suggestion that people would like to go to just take the chart that I did, recognize the commonalities, and ask the proposers of the various, one of the things we can do is ask the people who are put together proposals. First of all, you can combine informally. You don't need the chair's permission to combine, right? And second, you can update on what you think you've learned from the others. But could we take just a few minutes for the people who are not ready to say what they need to be ready?
He's got a queue.
Joel, you're in queue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Joel.
Okay, I'll try to answer that. I'm going to answer it backwards, though. The problem I have is that there are critical things that, as far as I can tell, are central to the approach of at least two of the three drafts that I think have serious problems. Therefore, I can't say either Mike's or Martin's are things that I'm comfortable with as a starting point, since things that I think they take as critical bases, I disagree with. The problem I have is I don't have a good answer up my sleeve. I don't know how to find an answer that avoids either of the extremes they lay out. Brian's just ducks the important questions, which, yeah, you can start from that, but it doesn't actually help. So I didn't feel it was worth saying I'll take Brian's because I don't think it would solve anything.
Just an observation that because you haven't sent text and no one else is stepping up to deal with the issues you're raising, you're not helping, right?
Brian, I realize that, and I wish I could do better, but not knowing an answer doesn't mean I must perforce like somebody else's.
All right, I got it. Ben.
Yeah, I think that one of the aspects that causes me to not be ready to make a decision at this point is that I don't understand, well, so basing on Elliot's table, we have several areas where there's differences between the drafts or collections of drafts. And what I don't have right now is an understanding of to what degree those areas of difference are fundamentally intertwined or if they are separable. And so if there's a question of, does the working group like structure need to have some public engagement or public exposure, that may be a separable thing, as opposed to sort of the structure of how the membership is chosen might have some particular details that are coupled. And so I would be more comfortable if we had a, do we want to start with A versus B, if we knew that all or most of the differences between A and B were sort of fundamentally correlated differences, and there were not additional things that we could tease apart and discuss as separate orthogonal issues.
Okay. Wes?
So I was trying to think of concrete ways out of situations like this, and there are many times in the IETF where this has worked and where it hasn't. Elliot's table, I think, had a great summary of what matched. I like the idea of sort of expanding upon that more, and that sort of got me to think along the lines of, well, if we're down to 2 drafts to possibly merge together, maybe one option is to actually merge the commonality points or the points that are agreed upon, throwing out everything else, and then adopting that as sort of a base framework upon which we need to add everything else back in. And it's essentially creating a list of topics, that must go in, before it's ready to be done. But in the meantime, if you could actually get all of your existing, and I think, there's a number of existing consensus items that have been worked through over the past 6 months or whatever it's been, just getting those consensus points down into a starting document and then building upon that and getting maybe a couple of authors to contribute equally, maybe Brian and Mike, for example.
Okay. Good suggestion, possible. John Quentin?
I find myself largely agreeing with Ben and Wes. I feel like I need to see the differences which we have been talking about more clearly articulated than the chart shows. Although I think the chart is a huge starting point. Following on Wes's comment, I think one of the things that might be considered is seeing if you can find a neutral editor, whatever neutral means in this highly controversial space, to start consolidating these 3 documents in areas where we really have agreement and make certain we do, and then try to fold the places where we don't have agreement into that new document, one thing at a time. I don't know if that's feasible. I don't know if you can find such a human being who would be willing to put up with the abuse, but it might be a way forward with some of this.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, just a chair's comment. I'm not entirely sure that it is possible to do what Wes suggested. And the reason is that the philosophical basis, if you will, the underpinnings of where Mike started versus where Martin and Brian started are quite different. It might be possible, and that's something I think that we as a group have to think a little bit about. I don't want to just leave that on the chairs. And something we'll have to discuss in mail. So I'll stop, but I just did want to make that comment. It's not a slam dunk to do what Wes suggested.
I didn't say it'd be easy. Thanks, Elliot. I agree. I do agree with that.
Let's see. Who else do we have here? Mike?
Bob, and then Mike, and then Martin.
Oh, Bob. Sorry, I skipped Bob.
Yeah, it's easy to miss the cue. Yeah, I think I like the idea, though I realize it is hard, of let's try to figure out which things there is some agreement on, separate that out from the things that there isn't, because then we can talk about them. I talk about the differences more specifically, and we may be able to reach some compromise or something. I think that, given the current situation, I think that would be better than just trying to pick documents.
Okay.
I think that's me.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. Just responding to Elliot, one of the things I wanted to actually say was I actually think my proposal is probably closer to Brian's than Brian's is closer to than Brian's is to Martin, even though they started from the same document. The main thing here is the question of the composition of the management board, editorial board, whatever you want to call it. But everything else is sort of a there's somebody that we hire that's important that's working this process on our behalf, even when we're sleeping.
A little more time, by the way, right? The meeting is going to go for another half hour. It's Martin, then Ecker.
So John, can you mute, please? Thanks. I thought we were having a discussion at this point about I think probably just two issues, and this goes back to Ben's question of what differences are we here to resolve, and it wasn't clear what those were to Ben, but I think to me at least the issues were very clear, and that was the choice between choosing Mike's draft or Brian's draft that was presented to us was, I thought, a decision to go for a closed board versus an open participation working group style decision-making process. And if we could make a decision about that, which drives a lot of the rest of the system, and I think a lot of the designs differences between those two drafts is driven primarily by that, then we make progress. Going to do what Wes suggested is nice, but it's the sort of busy work that we give people when they can't decide, so they can sort of build this rapport that you get when you start agreeing with people, and it's a great brainwashing technique, basically, and it does actually help people build that thing in a working group, but I don't think we need to do that. I thought we were really close to actually getting to the point where we were making that decision, but maybe that's just me.
All right. Ecker.
Yeah. I'm trying to decide if we're just chewing up this 30 minutes or if we're doing anything useful. It sounds like there's some thought that the others might go off and try to do some mergers, and we have this discussion then. Is there some topic we actually can discuss here that is useful, or are we just going to argue about like how we're not going to pick one out of this list? Because I'd like to have dinner if the answer is the second.
Yes. So there was a suggestion to try and see what kind of consensus we have on the primary difference between the two of them, which is who oversees, right? Is there a working group or a board? That isn't the only difference, but it is a difference. We could try that. We could see where people vote, or we can be done. You know, we can. Boy, echo. We can be done for today and take the path of trying to figure out if we find an editor, merge what we can merge, and see if we can work on consensus from there. We do have a half an hour or 25 minutes. We could try to see where people stand on that one issue, a board or a working group. there are others. I mean, we could that you picked one you thought that was the most important. There are other people who think other things.
It was actually MT who picked that one.
Yeah.
I have some others.
Yeah, right. There are others, but it's always nice to get some consensus, right? It would be good to exit the meeting with having accomplished something instead of spend another 2 hours not getting anything done. Not getting anything done is unfair. We're clearly understanding each other more than we have been. We're having good discussions. We're having people know where people stand on things. Their questions have been asked and answered. We have made progress. I'm not saying we didn't make any progress, but are there enough people who want to actually try and figure out where we stand on an issue like, is there a board or a work group, or would you like to just stop? I see several people saying stop.
I think I want to summarize just a little bit before we stop. And just to be clear as to what our next steps are, right? This is part of our agenda, right? I would like to see the proposals wheedled down, quite frankly, to 2 at this point, and that I'd like us to focus on the differences between the two, and that I would like us to be to the point where we're ready to adopt a draft within a month in order to move things forward. And Martin's right that there are pretty much 2 major differences. To be perfectly frank, Brian Carpenter, I do not see a major difference between. I think it's a resolvable problem as to whether through the ISOC BOT or through the IAB in the differences between you and Martin. Mike, I don't know if I agree with you about with you and John, but it may not matter too much. What I'd like you guys to do is just focus down on seeing if you can look at this slide, seeing what you find that is in common, and then discuss that part which you would change on list. We do that much, and then we'll take this forward from the back again as we approach the next. Actually, we're going to approach the next IETF if we don't do another interim.
Are people thinking an interim before 109 is useful, or should we just wait for 109?
We're going to make. I would make that call based on whether we can make progress
on the list. Okay, yeah. We can do that.
All right.
All right. Well, we know what we're doing. Thank you all very much.
Actually, hey, Brian, before you guys go.
Yeah.
One of the things that Heather did was make sure that this was not a one-shot deal and she did separate time zones. I noticed a good third of the folks who signed up on the doodle poll couldn't do it because of the time couldn't do it because of the time zone, or because of other things going on. You may want to think about trying to do one more of these things. Again, I'll show up even if it's in the middle of the night, but to be fair, you want to avoid as much as possible the self-selection problem. So
yeah, thanks
appreciate
for the comment, Mike.
Yeah. Okay.
I would comment, if people cared about this enough, this would be their number one thing.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I don't think people care about this enough, but we'll see. All right. Thank you all very much for your comments and your honesty. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye and good evening.
Bye.